Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have all of you here today. My name is Rohit Chopra. I'm a professor of communication at Santa Clara University, and I also work with the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, which is organizing this panel on anti-Indian racism and networked hate in North America. I'm thrilled to have fantastic speakers here today. We'll be having a panel discussion. Each speaker will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion out. And please do send in your questions through the chat, and we'll collate them in groups of maybe 3 or 4, and then the panelists will address them. So let me just start with a very, very brief introduction about what today's panel is about. The title is an indication, of course. Anti-Indian racism and networked hate in North America. Over the last, I would say, year or so, but particularly over the last few months in the US as well as Canada, there's been a marked rise in anti-Indian racism, or one should say, perhaps more precisely, racism against people who are perceived as Indian. So it might be South Asians, but people who are marked as Indians. And there is a sort of broader political context to this kind of hate, the backlash against immigrants, including Indians, with some of these characteristics of anti-Indian hate being common to people of color, people who are migrants, and some being directed specifically at Indians. And of course, there is a powerful online component to this, and networked component to this sort of exponential increase in hate, as it were, with the online component both reflecting what happens in society at large, but also in some ways sort of exacerbating it. So it's this landscape that our very distinguished group of panelists will be addressing today. And without further ado, let me just go ahead and start with our panelists. So our first panelist is Sid Venkatramakrishnan. And Sid is an editorial manager and analyst at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. So Sid, over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Rohit, and really excited to be here and be discussing this really very important topic. So, as Rohit said, there's been a really marked rise in anti-South Asian and anti-Indian hate in the US and Canada. And I'd say actually it should be seen as part of a broader anti-migrant hate, although it has very specific valences which make it at this point perhaps more noteworthy. And I just want to give one flashpoint in terms of data. I looked at Diwali posts by political figures in the US, so appointees as well as candidates and those who are currently in office. And in terms of the top responses to them, just over half were negative, and only 16 were positive. And if you looked at specific individuals, such as Kash Patel at the FBI, 7 out of 10 were very negative. Calls for him to return to his own country, or accusations that Diwali was a demonic or pagan celebration that had no place in the US. And I think this really speaks to the way in which Indians, although seen as Indian, I think Indian as a adjective which has certain connotations beyond belonging to India as a state, but also connotations around cleanliness and work ethic, things like that. I think we've really seen an effort by anti-migrant voices to push the model minority title away from Indians, those perceived as Indian, and instead to refigure them as being a threat to Western civilization, in line with other non-white groups, particularly Muslims and people from Africa. So I think this comes across a number of pillars. The first is the religious one. We've obviously seen a really strong emphasis on Christian identitarian politics. And I think if we look back to maybe in the 2000s, discussions around the Crusader mentality and the idea of defending the Holy Land, sort of usually being seen as being against Muslims, shifting to today, the idea of Groyper beliefs Christ is king, that non-Christian identity, be that Jewish or in this case Hindu, is a threat to Western civilization that seeks to undermine it. And therefore, things like Diwali are not merely bad things to celebrate, they're actively anti-Christian. The second pillar I'd look at is around jobs. And I think this is both at sort of blue-collar side as well as white-collar office jobs. Obviously, cases of truckers have been really emphasized in the Canadian context as being seen as taking jobs away from blue-collar Canadians, and discussions of terms like the flip-flop people and other kind of pejoratives being used for often Sikh drivers in Canada. But you see this applied as well to H1B H1B workers. This obviously was a large debate at the end of last year. But even if you look at Tim Cook, who had one of the most significant Diwali posts, one of the top responses to him discusses him pandering to H1B slave labor. And I think this is part of a broader idea of how Indians and those perceived as Indian are seen in terms of jobs, a move away from traditional model minority ideas of hard workers, of diligence and intelligence, instead a shift towards a belief that they are scammers, they are bad workers but cunning, and that they are able to draw on networks of patronage linked to caste or religious identity in order to keep their jobs. And you see this proliferating on anti-migrant Reddits and other places of claims that somebody's girlfriend's brother worked in a job and everyone there was Indian and they only hired them because they were Indian. And I think this actually echoes a lot of the narrative we see around the Great Replacement, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews are behind the importing of non-white migrants to Western countries in order to destroy them. And in this case, it's seen as being the South Asians themselves, the Indians themselves who are involved in this. And at least the other next part of the pillar, which is around politics and integration. Around Diwali, you had a lot of posts saying no one in this photo celebrated Diwali, for example, showing the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or other American historical events, including D-Day. The case of the Declaration of Independence tweet that received 34,000 likes. I think this speaks again to a shift away from a belief of integration and the possibility of integration to the idea that non-white migrants, in the case Indians, are incapable of making that switch for religious reasons, but also simply by their very nature. And I think we can see that in response to the hate directed at Kash Patel or Vivek Ramaswamy among Republicans, or attacks on Zoran Mandani in the New York context as being seen as eating rice, as being too alien to be understood or conceived as possibly decent in a Western context. A lot of emphasis on the third world and nature of this. And again, speaking to long-standing stereotypes of South Asians online as being dirty, as having limited understanding of hygiene, a lot of scatological humor and commentary related to them there. I think having also had these pillars, the last thing I'd want to sort of circle back to is around transnationalism. And I think what we've seen in the US context is really echoed abroad. And when you see these posts reposted, for example, by a British account that has a valence both in the US, where it sort of gives them support and legitimacy for US anti-migrant accounts posting this content, but also it allows a British account to say, look, they have the same problems over there, we need to do something about it. Or, look how bad things are over there, it'll be as bad for us if we don't do something about it. And for example, in the UK context, one of the top UK geolocated tweets around Diwali came from the Homeland Party, which is a far-right, explicit anti-migrant party. I think this really speaks to the fact that these narratives are being legitimized and spread by accounts deliberately trying to spread them across borders in order to generate the idea of a Western civilization that is under threat homogenously by the non-white hordes. And the last thing I'd say there very quickly is that looking beyond white ethno-nationalist accounts, you also have the use of anti-Indian hate by regional South Asian actors in often a tit-for-tat kind of narrative. So particularly after the 7th October attacks, where you had a lot of sort of conservative Hindu voice online coming out very strongly in support of Israel. You had a lot of attacks by Pakistani and Bangladeshi accounts accusing Indians of being slavishly pro-Israeli and sort of being lapdogs of Israel, but also in response to slurs used by Indian accounts against Pakistani and Bangladeshi accounts. You had the same sort of tit-for-tat slurs the other way around. So I realize my time now, so I'll quickly conclude here to say that again, these are all factors that play into each other, and that you have accounts across the spectrum who will opportunistically use these narratives to basically further their own ends. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sid, for that rich and wide-ranging talk where I'm sort of amazed that you managed to like compress so much stuff in such a nuanced and insightful manner in 7 minutes. And before we move on to our speaker, I was just struck at the fact that I'm not a fan of George W. Bush necessarily, but I do remember that he had used the word crusade in the aftermath of 9/11, and then he actually had apologized for that. And when you compare what is happening now in terms of public discourse, the contrast is striking. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Reena Kukreja, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Canada. Professor Kukreja, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Rakib and the Center for Study of Organized Hate, and also to Rohit Chopra for inviting me to this panel. Let me just quickly begin by providing a brief context to the transformations in Canadian society and political discourse, because many of you might not be familiar with it. So in the run-up to federal elections in Canada that just happened in March of 2025, political discourse from the conservative leaders squarely blamed Canada's housing and healthcare crisis, rising unemployment, to the increased migrant presence in the country, aka the presence of Indian migrants. The Conservative Party framed immigration of Indian students in particular, and those who had been approved for permanent residency, as a key issue challenging the stability of Canada as a civilized society. And again, great replacement theory was circulated widely in relation to the changing demographic pattern, and this all percolated down to a toxic outburst on the social media online against Indo-Canadians and Indian international students. In response, what did the Liberal government do? Faced with low popularity, they decided to scapegoat Indian international students. And since 2023, the Canadian government has enacted a series of restricted immigration policies that lowered yearly targets for permanent residents and reduced study and work permits for international students. The scapegoating has happened quite publicly by ministers making a statement that international students should not see study here as a backdoor entry into becoming a Canadian citizen, and Indian students are framed as visa scammers or visa abusers and as stealing jobs away from Canadians. So what gets forgotten in all of this is that in the last decade and a half, Canada actively sought to increase its immigration through points-based immigration system for PR. Simultaneously, both the Canadian state and Canadian postgraduate institutions actively wooed international students to come to Canada. In fact, one of the strategy of the liberal government was titled Building on Success. It said that international students make excellent PR candidates or permanent resident candidates who can help address, quote, this country's current and pending labor market demands. In fact, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada also produced a video with the slogan, and I quote, study, explore, work and stay. So education or immigration encouragement of students to view their education as a stepping stone towards immigration resulted in a sharp spike in the number of international students to come to Canada. So by year 2024, we had over 1 million international students in Canada, of which nearly half came from India. So we have to keep this figure in mind. And of course, the other thing is that post-2020 pandemic-related policy also allowed students to work full-time off campus. So many international students who were coming to Canada to study were paying 5 times more fee than the domestic one. And so they were using this part-time, this full-time off-campus work as a way to buttress their loans. So it is in this context of a poisoned anti-immigrant, anti-Indian political environment that in spring of 2024, I conducted a small study on the online spread of center-right populism and white supremacist ideology, both in Canada and Southern Europe, that targeted men, especially racialized male migrants. I chose these two regions because I'm conducting a research research in both of these places, and I've seen a sharp spike in far-right nativist and Islamophobic belief. So I looked at Instagram, I looked at Twitter and Reddit, and used keywords: international students, gig workers plus racism, gig economy in Canada plus racism, Indian students in Canada plus racism. And I focused on gig workers because this is a very hyper visible sector which brings people, which brings the workers in direct and intimate contact with ordinary folks, right? So, and for Reddit, I studied posts emerging from one specific group called Reddit, Canada Reddit, and it was a group that frames itself as nationalist, right? So, and my focus was more on ordinary Canadians rather than far-right groups, very much like what said also talked about, the political elites. So the findings are unsurprising. They reveal that the narratives that are peddled by far right, emanating from both the South, as in the US, and across, from Europe, have traveled over to Canada with the great replacement theory. And these have been borrowed by ordinary Canadians in TikTok and Instagram videos and posts as they choose selective images of crowded metro and bus stops and videos of bad driving, and they dog whistle Indians to show how Canada's under a civilizational threat, how Indians are overrunning Canada, and how by 2050, one of the most popular theme was Can India 2050, that by 2050, Canada would become Can India. And again, there are posts on hygiene or defecation, Indians defecating publicly on beaches. Instead of calling these videos out, in the province where I live, we had our premier actually allocate a funding of 1 million to build more washrooms, to instill better, yes, to instill better hygienic habits amongst new immigrants, right? Uh, and that's something that's happened. So the socialization of a culture of hate through diverse media and the role of state policies and state actors has led to the percolation of hate in the everyday. And this is where I look at how echo chambers are created with ordinary Canadians, ordinary dominant white group Canadians, feeding off each other's posts, but also how it shapes interactions in the everyday of daily life. And so it's resulted in my new study looking at immigration policies and gig workers. And I'll just quickly share a couple of quotes from uh, Indian international students who are working as gig workers, and they talk about the racial hate they're encountering. And I quote, "What the politicians speak about against Indians in the parliament is listened carefully by Canadians. When the leaders present us as criminals, then the impact of this narrative is felt by the ordinary Canadian. When they see us, they think we are all criminals, so they behave badly with us," unquote. And I'll quote another one. A female student working in a fast food joint said, "I come back to my room and just cry. I have to smile at the customers who are very racist to me and continue serving to them. My white colleagues don't say anything in defense when a customer is verbally abusive, maybe because they also feel the same way." So mental stress is a big consequence of everyday hate. And we also need to acknowledge that government statistics on police-reported hate crimes show a 200% increase in anti-South Asian hate crime in Canada. And I'll end my talk here and maybe have discussion open up later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reena. There was another very, very rich set of reflections, and I'm just very quickly want to comment on a few things among many, that, this production of amnesia, right? And the turnaround in amnesia is absolutely sort of stunning in such a short period of time. Then you also did mention that there is a gendered aspect to it, which I think is something we can explore in the conversation. And finally, of course, one of the ironies is that on the one hand, we are talking about the civilizing mission all over again, right? Civilizing these sort of barbaric immigrants, While on the other hand, if you look at the kind of sentiments that have been expressed in North America, it very much gives the lie to this claim of Western exceptionalism as being, Westerners or Western societies, Western democratic societies as somehow being inherently democratic, pluralistic, liberal, while the rest of the world isn't. So I was very struck by some of those juxtapositions. Thank you so much. So we'll move on to our final panelist, and our final panelist is Stephanie Chan, and Stephanie is Director of Data and Research for Stop AAPI Hate, that's Asian American and Pacific Islander. So Stephanie, over to you, please.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to share about what our data and research team at Stop API Hate has been seeing in regard to rising anti-South Asian hate in the US. And when possible, I do disaggregate the findings specifically on anti-Indian hate. So first of all, a note of warning that I will be sharing real experiences of anti-South Asian racism, violence, and harm. So just want everyone to prepare themselves to hear this disturbing content. A couple of definitions first. At Stop API Hate, we define hate as the various ways in which racism, prejudice, and discrimination show up on the interpersonal and institutional levels. And we define a hate act as any event motivated by bias or prejudice, whether explicit or implicit, against a person or group's actual or perceived identity or identities that inflicts individual or community harm. And at Stop API Hate, we track anti-Asian American and anti-Pacific Islander, or anti-AAPI, hate in three ways. Sorry, that should say anti-API hate. The first is through our Hate Act Reporting Center. So we have an online reporting center where anyone can report an act of hate they've experienced or witnessed. Second is through our annual nationally representative survey on anti-AAPI hate that we conduct with NORC at the University of Chicago. This helps us to gauge the prevalence of experiencing hate in the US year to year. And the third is we monitor online target spaces associated with targeted violence with a group called Moonshot that does this tracking, and we receive data on anti-Asian slurs and anti-Asian threats of violence from them. So turning to the online data first, let me present some findings. So if you look at this chart, this is a chart of anti-Asian slurs observed in online spaces associated with targeted violence. This includes both popular and more niche social media platforms like 4chan, Gab, True Social, and X. And you can see that since they've been tracking since January 2023 up to the present, anti-South Asian slurs on these platforms have been on the rise. So they've been steadily increasing. And as others have mentioned, lately there's been these spikes in anti-South Asian racism as well. And what you also see is that the number of anti-South Asian slurs is higher than the number of East Asian and South Asian slurs. So they are the majority of anti-Asian slurs in these online spaces. To understand why this is happening, let's take a look at some recent spikes. So there was a recent spike in July 2024 and August 2024, and this is when Usha Vance and Kamala Harris entered the election spotlight. We saw the biggest spike so far in December 2024 and January 2025. This was right after the election. Trump had won, and there was also a hot debate between Trump's followers about H-1B visas and whether or not they should be ended or allowed. And then the latest spike we're seeing has been this recent spike that we're still in the midst of that started around May. And I should note that in April, there's an artificial dip here because 4chan was down for 2 weeks. And this is one of the main platforms on which anti-South Asian hate is spread. So we see that right now we're experiencing another rise, and this is due to, visibility on the India-Pakistan conflict that happened in May. Zohar Mamdani won the election right at the end of June, beginning of July. And we're also seeing, continued discourse around H-1B visas, as well as very notable incidents. And I will say that some of the July rise was due to some things that happened in Canada. So we do see that things that are happening in Canada are also affecting hate in the US. Here's some awful examples of the type of hate that's being spread in these online extremist spaces. So one post claimed that too many, and this is one of the common slurs against South Asians, PAJEETS, are getting involved in US politics, taking over the government, and turning America into a third world country. Another post claimed that anyone hiring J slur or Jews is committing treason and will be hanged in future tribunals. Moving into more mainstream spaces, we also see this discourse. So you can see that when this People magazine posted a picture of J.D. Vance and Usha Vance, Stu Peters, a right-wing commentator, said there's an obvious Indian coup taking place in the US right before our eyes. And I recently saw this post from a user on social media. She lives in Frisco, Texas. She was at Costco. She took her camera and filmed the Costco where there's a lot of Indian people. And she says the Indian takeover, hardly any Americans in sight. And she specifically cites H-1B betrayal, robs our people of jobs, wipes out our heritage, and erases our communities. America's harsh new reality, the great replacement unfolding. So you can see in all of these spaces the same kind of themes, the great replacement theory, Indians are taking over, they're taking away our jobs. And we do see a lot of discourse related to what Sid and Rena had mentioned about, lack of hygiene, being backwards, and dirty as well. And so this hate does not stay online. So the other thing we track, right, is through our survey data, we look at how many Indian adults say they have experienced a hate act in the US due to their race, ethnicity, or nationality. And we are seeing a rise. So in 2023, 40% of Indian adults said they experienced a race or ethnicity-based hate act. But in 2024, this rose to 55%. And we'll do our next annual survey to look at 2025 in January 2026, and we'll be able to report on that trend. And just to give you an illustrative example of what this looks like when it's reported to us, here's an example from an Indian woman in Texas. Customer came in asking for help with something, and me and my coworker were calmly explaining what the process is going to be, and he stands up and starts yelling at us. So I tell him calmly not to yell at us, and he starts yelling profanities and proceeds to say, "I am glad Trump is deporting you, B word, and I hope you have a green card," and keeps calling us Indian S word, tramp, and troll. But I don't want to end on this note. I want to show that people are also fighting back. So some recent notable examples of people fighting back against this anti-Indian hate on social media is that there was a Palm City city councilman who posted all these anti-Indian posts on social media. Over 100 residents showed up at the city council meeting to denounce these posts, and eventually the city council voted in favor of censoring him. We also saw that Andrew Cuomo, NYC mayoral candidate, posted a racist ad against candidate Zohran Mamdani during the debate, and social media users quickly condemned this, and the campaign quickly took down the ad. So we do see examples of people fighting back as well. So in sum, I would say that the major theme is that people are really fearful and feel threatened by greater South Asian visibility, whether in politics or in economics, and they are reacting with xenophobia and scapegoating of immigrants. And that's why we're seeing a lot of this percolation of anti-Indian, but also wider anti-immigrant sentiment in the US.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was fascinating, and of course, also as with the other talks, raises issues that are like disturbing. But that was a marvelous combination of empirical, of showing how this hate can be mapped both in terms of this very fine-grained empirical analysis and narratives, and how one feeds into the other. And I've also been sort of taken aback a little bit and surprised at the fact that if you think of the number of people who are here on H-1B visas, it's probably in the US, maybe 150, 200,000, something like that. And 4 or 5 years ago, this was not an issue at all. So, is it the online? Is it the changing political climate? What is it that is, has made this so inflammatory? And I think one of the points that your talk emphasized was greater visibility. So in that sense, even Vance and Vivek Ramaswamy are they may have their own sort of particular politics, which in the larger context, in some ways aligns with MAGA, but they also sort of contribute to this. So thank you very much to all our panelists for these very enlightening and illuminating and thought-provoking presentations. We have a few questions in already, but I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists a question first. Let me start with Sid. We'll just go in order of the speakers. So Sid, if you could speak a little bit more about the transnational dimension of this, that, in what ways is this a transnational phenomenon with cross-fertilization or different kinds of far-right movements and anti-Indian racist narratives borrowing from each other? That would be great.
Of course, thank you. So I guess that there's two sides to that. One is the other anti-migrant, what are increasingly, I'd say, white ethnic nationalist movements in other countries. So, particularly in the UK, Australia, Anglophone contexts, is that you see the same narratives being borrowed across, and actually around Diwali, saw a lot of similar discourse being targeted at public figures or institutions who posted about Diwali in celebrating it. In the UK, for example, the Reform Party put out a post about Diwali, and you saw very similar kind of comments targeted towards the party as you saw towards, say, Kash Patel in the US, or towards the ODNI office, which had put out the post of Donald Trump celebrating Diwali. So I think that as with wider anti-migrant contexts discourse, the idea is that both narratives and tactics are to be shared, and if you saw around the riots last year around Southport, you saw a lot of US accounts piling in on this on Telegram and spaces like that, both because they saw it as a chance for their compatriots in the UK to do something they supported, but also in a way to kind of further their own propaganda, to use it as images of what could be achieved. And I think that's the core message of these accounts, are that there is a united Christendom that is defined by, broadly speaking, white countries in the West, and that defending it is of utmost importance. And the way to do that is partially through supporting allies in other countries, but also drawing messages from them on how to be more effective. The other aspect to touch on is just about the use, again, of anti-Indian slurs by non-white groups. And we've seen this in the region, kind of regional politics, where, for example, I've seen on Facebook some Indian accounts mocking deaths of Bangladeshis using slurs like Kanglu and things like that, aimed at Bangladeshis. In response, Bangladeshi accounts calling Indians Pajits. If you look at the use of Pajit, which is a very common, for those who are not aware, very common anti-Indian slur. If you look at that on Facebook, previously it was all white nationalist or anti-migrant accounts using it up until about 2015. And over the last 5 years, it's all been Pakistani meme accounts adopting it. So it is very much cross-fertilized. And does it, I think, does it have the same valence or the same kind of meaning? Not quite. It's used by these accounts often as an attack on Hindus, or kind of sometimes allied with Hindu nationalists. And it does have slightly different meanings, but it is, again, used in that sense of Indians basically being bad. I think in some ways what it speaks to more is just a normalization of anti-Indian hate as something that is not necessarily seen through a purely political lens, but also almost an aesthetic lens, and a kind of almost a kind of low-level, just something which can be used. I think what I've seen on places like Reddit, among discussions among Indians is why are Indians attacked in a way that other ethnic groups are not, or are seen as being okay to make these jokes. And I think that is something which it is a question which I don't really have an answer to yet. But I think it does speak to the fact that these because these ideas are hybridized and spreading, they are becoming part of just the normal discourse.
Sorry. Flashback to pandemic time, forgetting to unmute. So yeah, it's ironic that Indians are also contributing in all these ways to that normalization of anti-Indian hate. Thank you so much, Sid. So Reena, and a question for you is, could you speak to, you mentioned towards the end of your talk how this networked hate is sort of percolating into the everyday. right? And it's part of everyday discourse, and it's also echoed and amplified by political parties. And if you could speak more to that, that would be wonderful.
Um, yeah, so everyday hate is a really disturbing phenomenon that I'm seeing in my study that I'm doing, both in the survey and the qualitative interviews that I'm conducting. And everyday hate becomes very difficult to prove because these are perceived acts of racist aggression, right? You cannot really say that someone did a hate slur to me. So that's one aspect of everyday hate. But on the other hand, this normalization of online toxic hate has led to people being openly racist and abusive. So there's a sharp spike in open verbal aggression, calling out people about their ethnic identity. And with relation to the Indian students who are men, and that's something of a gendered aspect that you alluded to before, who drive the Ubers, framing of them as threats to white women. So warning women not to take Ubers driven by these brown men because they are essentially inherently rapists. So this whole white civilizational narrative of, or what I would say the current day femo nationalism is being massaged into the everyday discourse, where people are not verbally saying I'm using this femo nationalist discourse, but presenting themselves as saviors. So saying you should take a ride with a white taxi driver. You're inviting yourself to more harm. The other egregious way in which this is working is, apart from online social, dating apps saying no South Asians or no Indians, is the haranguing of white women with an Indian partner, walking in a restaurant and even the staff saying, "Why are you with this guy?" Right? And that's something that we had not witnessed in Canada. Canada is essentially considered a very polite kind of country, right? So that is the everyday. On the other hand, the everyday impact is felt 24/7 by those who are at the receiving end, because they feel that there's no way we can get any racial justice because the political elites are speaking out against us. How do we go to the police and say that someone was rude to us verbally, but no one else is standing witness? Right? So it takes a lot to draw up the courage. And there is, what I'm witnessing, a very problematic culture where the Indian community is in denial. They say, "Oh no, it was just a tiny bit of racism, not much." And I'm like, how can you have this tiny bit and not much, right? I mean, racism is racism. And they're unwilling to call it out. The other way in which everyday hate is acting out is creating ethnic distanciation or ethnic divide, something which, was alluded to before, creating divides between Indian origin Canadians, second generation Canadian Indians, and those who were here earlier in relation to those who are newly arrived. So blaming the newly arrived as putting all Canadian Indians at risk, right? Instead of bowing down, keeping your head low, being assimilating quietly to the dominant culture, why are you playing your music loudly? So that becomes a big issue. The other way in which I'm seeing this everyday hate work out is by having the Bangladeshis and the Pakistanis distance themselves by saying, "Hey, we are not Indians, we are Pakistani or Bangladeshi. We don't know why we were targeted. It should be the Indians who should be targeted." Instead of looking at how racism attacks all racialized bodies and that we need to tackle it by joining forces, what we are seeing is a kind of divide and rule strategy in place. And there's a lot of suicide ideation, something what Stephanie also alluded to. Many of the students have committed suicide. If you look at the stats are showing an ever increasing number of Indian students killing themselves, jumping off the tracks, taking an overdose of drugs, primarily because they're unable to cope with this. In my interviews, almost everyone's breaking down and crying and saying, I don't know how long I can take this. Right? So that's, I would say, the various dimensions of this everyday hate, which is lived and experienced 24/7, and which is enacted against them in the everyday routine acts. And what makes it worse is people don't know when they are going to get it and from where.
Thank you so much. I had no idea about, the link to the increase in attempts at suicide, for instance. So it's a sort of timely reminder that although we know that the online has an impact, I certainly sometimes am guilty of thinking of it as being separate from, it's not as bad in real life, right? Maybe that's just an illusion we kind of hang on to. So thank you very much, Reena. And Stephanie, is there any data on how, Indian Americans, South Asian Americans are sort of pushing back, fighting back at this, and combating this?
Yes, thank you, Rahi. And so much of what Rena said just totally resonated because what we do at Stop API Hate is collect these reports. And so much of what Rena said is just what we are seeing as well in the US. And the mental distress, one thing we look at in our survey is we compare the mental health outcomes with those who have experienced hate and those who haven't. And those who have experienced hate, it's much, much worse. And the problem is that a lot of resources to combat hate go to policing rather than going to healing or helping the people who have experienced it. And this is not helpful when, especially if you are an immigrant, you are more scared to go to the authorities, right, to say anything, or more scared to go into any government entity, right, whether it's a civil rights agency or a law enforcement agency. So we do see a lot of problems around, trying to cope with this without having mechanisms of healing in place for our communities. But speaking to your question, Rohi, we do have data on whether or not people are fighting back against this. So in our annual survey, we not only ask about experiences with hate, but we ask about activities of resistance and response. And so one of the things we ask is, in the past year, did you participate in any activities to reduce or resist racism? And we did see that the majority of South Asian adults said that they participated in something, whether that was sharing their experience to raise awareness or confronting anti-Asian slurs when they heard them or participating politically or civically. But on the flip side, the other thing that we're seeing is that we found that South Asian adults are participating a lot less than East Asian and Southeast Asian adults. So for Southeast Asian adults, 74 participated in some kind of action. For East Asian, it was 67%. And again, the percentage for South Asian was 57%. And I do think it's related a bit to what Rena was saying. What we found too is that those who experience hate are much more likely to get involved in these fights for justice, right? So I think it's that portion of those who have experienced it that are more likely to get involved, which is a sad thing. But it is also showing people that you thought you were safe from racism, right? Maybe because of the model minority myth or things have been quiet for a while, but it will rear its ugly head and you are part of that and will be implicated too. And speaking to the idea of solidarity, we think it's so important because in the US, with COVID, we saw that no one could tell the difference between any Asian people, right? Whether or not you were Japanese or Korean, you're still getting attacked for the China virus and spreading it, right? And we kind of see similar things with South Asian communities too. Maybe they're trying to attack Indian people, but they are attacking Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, and other South Asian people too. So I think there's such a huge opportunity for solidarity because the racism is affecting all these communities, regardless of whether or not it's your specific ethnicity they're trying to target, because people cannot distinguish among different types of Asian people. That is very clear, from our data. I remember seeing these really old newspaper like cartoons from when Japanese people were getting incarcerated in the US, and there was like a cartoon of sign of a Chinese person saying, "I'm not Japanese." Like that's not what we need to be doing here. What we need to be doing is sticking together, and across like different regional groups as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Stephanie. Absolutely. And I can, attest to the fact that in the supposedly very liberal Bay Area, where where the sort of belief is that a city like San Francisco, where I live, which prides itself on being inclusive, these sentiments are certainly prevalent too. They're everywhere. So it's not that any particular sort of liberal hotspot, as it were, is exempt. And I think Rina also mentioned that the self-image of Canada as a very polite society has also seen these sentiments. So we have some questions, and the questions, I think, very interestingly complement and converge with some of the thoughts that panelists have already shared. Uh, and I can, mention a few of, I can sort of raise a few of these, and the panelists can respond to them. So Alexandra has a question, which actually is something that Rina spoke about, which is, and Alexandra says that as a white British woman married to an Indian man, I'm increasingly aware of the anti-immigration nationalist discourse. So the whole idea, as in colonialism, of white women in need of protection from dangerous brown men. And I'm reminded of Gayatri Spivak's statement that the logic of colonialism was, saving the white man, saving the brown woman from the brown man. Alexander wants to know, is this happening in the US and North America both? And I can just sort of add that, there is a sort of way in which this discourse percolates even liberal spaces like the academy. Like I have heard, sentiments among supposedly liberal academics about, we know Arab men have these attitudes, or we know that, this is a typical Indian male attitude, including from, scholars who work on India, which has been, very dismaying to me, that kind of liberal racism, as you will. So that's one question. And then let me combine a few questions. Lalita has a question about some of the Indians mentioned here are themselves part of racist white supremacist groups. Do they perceive the same type of hate as South Asians, whose politics do not align the same way with the hate groups? So, does it apply to everyone? And then there's another question, a couple of questions about how inter-community fissures around caste, transnational repression, what some might call Hindu phobia, are contributing to the rise of anti-South Asian and anti-Indian racism. Is it the case that drawing attention to caste privilege is actually strengthening the hand of the American right, as it were? So if the panelists in any order could just speak to this, and you could just raise your hand, or just, we can just take it from here. Yes, Rina, please.
Thank you. I could see a lot of synergy with a few of the thoughts. So the first is I'll quickly talking about the experience of whites, the saviorism, the savior syndrome. Yes, as I did mention, it's very it's beginning to rear its strong head over here, both online as well as in public discourse, in terms of blaming the racialized male as dangerous, and it's using the same old tropes of misogynist, dangerous man who should not be trusted. He's an abuser, a sexual assault person, and you saw that narrative pick up, especially with the grooming gangs in England. I mean, Sid can talk more about it. So you see this how it's generalized to a whole group, and I'll just give you a quick example in Iceland, because I'm doing research over there. So the Icelandic drivers, taxi cab drivers, they go and surround a woman who is getting into an Uber car driven by a brown-bodied male, right? And they say you're opening yourself to a sexual assault. So it's come down to such a level where women do not even have the choice to take an Uber of their own liking. Right? And this is the kind of femo-nationalist policy that we are seeing over here. I'm talking about Islamophobia and, the transnational mobility of hate discourses from India. Those have happened, and they are very evident online in Canada as well. But what they've resulted is in a kind of a fissure, a breakup of groups, right? So saying it is the Indian Sikhs, the Indian Gujaratis who are responsible for this, because the largest proportion of international students from India are coming from these two provinces. So it's not the Indian Muslim migrant who is as much to blame, but it is these two communities, and therefore the rise of that specific slur. Um, and I'm not sure whether the the kind of movement to recognize caste supremacy, by Dalit groups has been a big factor. We do live in a bubble. We have to understand it's some of the hate that is emerging is one that has been picked up and circulated by far right groups, right? It's not in the radar right now. Caste is not a big thing. So I would not say it is a big factor, but definitely this whole narrative about the great replacement, white civilization under threat, and we have to protect ourselves is a big narrative. And unfortunately, the divide is being experienced between different groups of racialized people. One of the interviews that I did in Kingston had Mexican people tell me that we want to make sure that we are distanced from the Indians because we are, we don't want to be seen as them. Sometimes we can be perceived as them. Indians are dirty, right? And we are not. So it is how different groups are reworking themselves as model minority, and in the process forgetting that maybe a few years ago they were presented as criminals, right? So yeah, what I'm trying in sum is to say is that the narrative of hate will always revolve around the racialized black or brown body. But the targeted ethno-national or religious group may rework itself suited to political expediency of the moment.
Thank you. That's so succinctly put, and I think I will quote you on that line. I'm going to use it in my class tomorrow, actually. Stephanie or Sid, do you want to also respond to the questions?
I was going to jump in quickly to say I'm reminded of the I think it was after 9/11, sort of the "Don't Freak, I'm a Sikh" t-shirts that used to sort of be again put as distancing Sikhs from Muslims. I will say on the caste issue, I've started to see it becoming slowly becoming more prevalent online, and I think it's usually used in terms of, oh look, this is what Hindus think of other Hindus, and this is the same way that a high caste Hindu looks down on low caste Hindu, we look down on all Indians in the same way. And I think part of that is because you'll have, which I think it gets into this bizarre politics of accounts online which are seemingly white nationalist or kind of pro-Western, but are accused of being run by Indians. Quite often there's a very strong discourse around these Greek statue profile picture accounts on X, for example, which are accused of being Indian because people ask them to say something bad about Vishnu and they won't, and stuff like that, which is an interesting diversion. But definitely, I think that I think caste being adopted slowly just is another reminder of how opportunistically anything that can be exploited to show the alienness of the other will be used by ethno-nationalists.
Yeah, and I can speak to Lolita's question about some of the Indians mentioned here are themselves part of racist white supremacist movements. Do they receive the same type of hate as South Asians whose politics do not align the same way? And what's interesting is that they're very indiscriminate politically too. I mean, they are attacking their own, right, like on the right, who share the same political ideology. And I almost feel like there's just a great article that just came out from Salon that was showing how, Vivek Ramaswamy and Kash Patel, I think referring to some of that anti-Diwali messages that Sid was referencing, that like they are being attacked a lot, right? So aligning themselves politically with that party does not protect them at all from racism. And I think that's what's becoming clearer. And I've seen some other articles that have been written on this as well, that I think some South Asian Americans are realizing, wait, I voted for them, but why is all this like hate coming towards me, still? So I think there is some slow, recognition. And I think this is happening, in other Asian communities as well who, voted or aligned with that political ideology. But yeah, it shows you that no amount of assimilation, right, to that political ideology will really protect you from this ultimately xenophobic sentiment and white nationalist Christian sentiment that's perpetuating those politics.
Thank you. Yeah, to Sid's point, I was reminded of Peter Navarro making that reference to Brahmins in India exploiting others. And I think they will just use what's grist to their mill. And also, many of these accounts are indeed run by, these seeming MAGA accounts are run by, BJP IT cell or pro-Hindutva, pro-Israel trolls. And I was just thinking that, well, one of the things you've succeeded in doing is get this $100,000 like H-1B tariff. And Stephanie, absolutely. I was reminded of an article recently in the New York Times which talks about Indian Americans who voted for Trump now, regretting it, many of them. And that actually brings us to, what could be the final question. And there's a couple of questions we have about this, which is, many of the Indian Americans who voted for Trump are also supporters of Hindu nationalism, and they're pro-Modi, pro-BJP. So a couple of questions we have out here are how does Hindutva and Hindu nationalism, the ideology of Hindu nationalism, which, we know many far-right Hindu nationalist groups in the US who very sort of exultant about Tulsi Gabbard and Vivek Ramaswamy and Usha Vance and so on. How does that factor in to this, this kind of uh, uh, and their Islamophobia? How does that play into the anti-Indian racism? What's the sort of relationship there with all its complexities? And, I'm sure there is a sort of parallel in the Canadian case as well. So if very briefly, each panelist could speak to that, we can then move towards wrapping up our discussion.
I can begin because I see a question asking me to clarify on the reworking for political expediency. So, I mean, historically, different racial or ethno-national groups have been blamed as the other, right? The discourse of othering has revolved around them. Let's begin even with the Irish, going on to the Italian, going on, the Italians as the mafia folks, and then going on to the Portuguese in Canada. I'm talking about the Canadian context. Historically, too, even though Canada used Chinese labor and Japanese labor, yet during the 1920s and during the World War II, we faced a lot of negative discourse around them. And so what I'm saying is, depending on the political moment, for political elites to seize power, this is how they rework certain discourses that are pre-existing and give a new mask to it. And that's what I'm saying. It varies from moment to moment, but it still revolves on a foundational edifice of the racialized other. The racialized other, who constitutes the racialized other, always shifts or can shift, right? It can be an East Asian, it could be the South Korean. Today it is the Indian who's being villainized. Tomorrow it could be someone else, right? So it is a constantly shifting terrain, but what remains stable is that it is the racial other. And again, it is for seizing political power or maintaining political power. Going on to, you're right about talking about how many of the Indians are themselves quite racist. We need to also acknowledge that Indians are extremely racist too, towards other racial groups, particularly the blacks as well. They're very Islamophobic. I'm not wanting to generalize, and that carries over in online discourses. I saw that on Reddit. Reddit Canada had many Indians origin people talking, vilifying the Muslims, blaming themselves for blaming the Muslims for many of the ills that plague Canada, including the dilution of the Canadian culture. which is more open and welcoming, wanting to make it one which is totally hijabi based. And here I'm just using scare quotes so that you understand it's not me. And that results in a kind of justification, right, which is used by others to bring up and say, look, the Indians are saying that, so what's wrong in us also narrating this? And I'll briefly end because I know others have time too to speak, and we have to wrap up.
Sid, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say it's not quite reciprocal radicalization, but I think one thing I have noticed is that I guess the traditional idea, or traditional is probably the wrong word, but the long-standing idea was there's a Hindu nationalist, Christian nationalist, Jewish nationalist axis being discussed of say BJP, the GOP, Israeli parties. I think that has been very much sundered. Both that's become much less much more contested offline. Certainly online, you see a lot of Hindu nationalists now fighting with ethno-nationalists online, and sort of contested spaces there where you see a lot of slurs used towards Indians, and then vice versa, accusations that white Europeans or people of white European origin are degenerate, that they're actually the real perverts, they're the real sex threats, and so on. So it is interesting how these narratives are shifting away from being, I guess, a sense of alliance in some spaces, at least purely around Islam, to an idea that the colonizer, the traditional trope of sort of white threats are sort of re-emerging as a separate category to Hindu nationalists, and a distancing from that, which I think in turn is adopted and used by ethno-nationalist and kind of adjacent groups to say that Hindu nationalists are not our friend, Indians are not our friends, and sort of furthers this cycle of othering.
And of course, the irony is that the Hindu nationalist movement in its origins was, inspired by European ethno-nationalist movements in the 19th century. Stephanie, final thoughts towards wrapping up, and then I'll just take a couple of minutes before we formally conclude.
Yeah, I mean, I'm learning a lot right now about the Hindu far right and Hindutva. But I will say, on the contrary, one thing we see in the data is that Indian Americans are kind of one of the most are the most progressive Asian American group. So we have two things happening at the same time, right? We have, this movement towards the right, but we also have a really solidly left and progressive, base of Indian Americans. So I think that's interesting, and I think that gives me a lot of hope too, that we will see more people rising up against the hate that we're seeing.
Thank you. And I think that's a wonderful note of optimism to conclude on. So I just want to mention very quickly before I say my thanks. The Center for the Study of Organized Hate, we have a big event coming up, which co-organizing with the center at Berkeley. It's an in-person event on November 12th. It's on democracy, human rights, and big tech in South Asia. And if you're in California, the Bay Area, please do register. I've shared the link. Please do, share news of it with anyone who might be in the area. So we'd be very grateful for that. And then I just want to thank the Center for the Study of Organized Hate. I want to special shout out to Aldi, who's our tech whiz, who makes sure everything goes smoothly. And immense gratitude to the panelists. Rina, Sid, Stephanie, thank you so much. This was, I learned so much, and I'm sure we could keep the conversation going. And hopefully we will have, a series of such conversations. That's our plan at CSOH. And we'll be fortunate enough to feature the speakers who've been here today again as well. So thank you very much. And, and thank you very much to all of the attendees who made the time on a Tuesday morning, afternoon, night, as the case may be, depending on where you are in the world. We really do appreciate that as well, and your support. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.